They called him by many names: the Serpent of Nox, the Shadow Lord, the Whisperer beyond flesh. But within the sealed archives of the Ordo Malleus, his true legend is recorded only in whispers and coded liturgies. Some say he was once a psyker of great promise, perhaps trained within the Scholastia Psychana before his mind was consumed by forbidden hunger. Others believe he was never human at all, that the warp itself shaped a vessel from the echo of ancient sin, a being forged from the residue of countless dark covenants. Whatever the truth, he rose in the underhive like a myth-given blood, gathering to him the lost, the bitter, the disillusioned. His creed promised power unbound by the corpse god's chains. His symbol, a serpent coiled around an empty crown. Those who heard his words did not merely obey, they worshipped. His cult spread through hive spires, manufactoria, and derelict shrines, whispering of liberation through fear. To the administratum he was a rumor, to the Inquisition a contagion of the soul, and to the chaos gods, perhaps a rival. For his dominion was not born of devotion, but of will, a will so absolute that even demons hesitated to claim him. Yet what if such a figure truly emerged in the age of the Imperium? What would it mean for a being who seeks immortality not through faith, but through dominance of the warp itself? If you find fascination in the intersections of myth and heresy, in the echoes where magic meets the immaterium, then stand with us. Subscribe, share this chronicle, and let the archives of forbidden knowledge grow, for the more eyes that witness, the harder it becomes for truth to be erased. In the cold archives beneath Terra's surface, where the air hums with the faint vibration of containment fields and the scent of sanctified oil hangs heavy, there exists a vault known only to the Ordo Malleus. Its walls are layered in sigils of warding, its shelves stacked with data slates wrapped in parchment and sealed in wax. Within these forbidden records lies an anomaly, a chronicle not of a demon nor of a primarch but of a man, a name redacted by decree of the High Lords. The marginalia, however, call him Serpens Rex, the Serpent King. He was not born in glory, nor raised among the Schola Progenium. His origins trace instead to a remote psychic enclave somewhere along the Gothic fringe, a place where the Scholastia Psychana trained their most volatile adepts, those too dangerous for service yet too gifted for execution. It was here in whispered fragments of training logs that his existence first emerges. Subject displays exceptional willpower, one report notes. Shows disregard for sanctioned method. Seeks dominion of thought rather than communion. The archivist's hand trembles on the page, a quiet warning. Those who try to rule the warp seldom live to record it. Among sanctioned psychers, control is survival. The warp is not a servant. It is a sea of emotion, thought, and hunger. Yet this one sought to reshape it, to bend its tides through symbols and language, not unlike the hexes and runes of old Terra's arcane traditions. His rituals were precise and his approach mathematical. He spoke of resonance, of psychic harmonics, as though the immaterium were a symphony to be mastered rather than endured. Such thinking bordered on heresy, and in time, it became it. When the Inquisition first discovered the ruins of his enclave, the scene was described as eerily silent. Not burned, not torn apart by demons, silent. Vox records captured the low hum of residual energy, a psychic echo repeating faint words in a tongue no lex mechanic could translate. What the adepts did not record, but only whispered later in private, was that the sound seemed to answer their thoughts. It spoke when they were afraid. It mocked when they prayed. The investigators found a single data slate intact, sealed in a hexed containment field. Its content has been classified for millennia, but a fragment survived through cross-reference. The soul is not a vessel for power. It is the shape that power takes when given will. Those words, if indeed his, mark the genesis of something far darker. For in rejecting the Emperor's light, he did not seek chaos. He sought ownership. Ownership over the self and, by extension, over the warp that mirrors all selves. What began as theory soon grew into practice. Survivors from nearby settlements spoke of a figure who walked among them cloaked in ash, his voice a calm whisper that entered the mind rather than the ear. He cured the sick, not through medici skill, but by peeling their illness away like a shadow torn from flesh. Those he healed called it a miracle. Those who followed him learned to fear it, for the afflictions he removed did not vanish. They gathered. The air itself grew thicker, colder, as though emotion was being drained into some unseen reservoir. The administratum dismissed these tales as rural hysteria, the typical warp phantoms of frontier worlds. But one name kept surfacing: the Serpent, a title drawn from an ancient Terran myth meaning wisdom, treachery, and rebirth. By the time the Inquisition arrived to investigate, the settlements were deserted. Only the symbol remained: a coiled serpent etched into stone and bone alike, its eyes hollow, its crown empty. To those who study heresy, patterns are prophecy. A psyker who masters others through fear echoes the oldest of human legends, the tyrant who equates love with weakness and immortality with domination. The Ordo's records make subtle reference to such archetypes, noting that the human mind shapes the warp as much as the warp shapes the mind. If one man believed himself eternal, the warp would answer, not in truth but in reflection. The Imperium rewards conviction more than righteousness. It is believed that sometime after his disappearance, this serpent found passage aboard a trade vessel bound for the Segmentum Obscurus. He traveled as a scholar, his psychic aura carefully suppressed. The logs mention a passenger matching his description, thin, pale, bearing the insignia of an expired Scholastia credential. No name given, no destination declared. From there, the trail dissolves into void space, but the warp remembers what men forget. In later centuries, psychers across neighboring systems reported identical dreams. A corridor lined with mirrors, a voice whispering their names backward, and at its end, a crown floating above a serpent's skull. Some dismissed it as a warp resonance, a coincidental alignment of psychic frequencies. Others, particularly among the Ordo's demonologists, saw it as evidence of a lingering consciousness, an intellect attempting to rebuild itself through thought alone. Such persistence suggests an entity of unusual will. The warp devours most psychers upon death, dispersing their essence into raw emotion. Yet here was a signature pattern, self-contained, recursive, unyielding. It appeared, then vanished, then reappeared in entirely different sectors, as if carried by faith itself. And with each reemergence came new cults, minor at first, gathering under banners of rebirth, promising freedom from the corpse god's dominion. If these accounts are true, then the being once called Serpens Rex achieved what few mortals ever could: continuity without form, a mind so defiant it refused to scatter, existing as an echo in the thoughts of those who feared or adored him. Not a demon, not a god, something rarer, a soul that believed in itself more than any divinity. And that belief in the grim darkness of the far future is the first step toward damnation. The first true record of his reappearance comes not from the Inquisition, but from a Mechanicus outpost orbiting the dead world of Vostrix 9. A servitor patrol retrieved a fragmentary distress signal broadcast on a frequency long abandoned by the Astra Telepathica. The signal contained no voice, only a pattern, 3 ascending tones repeating every 7 seconds. At first glance it was meaningless, but when translated through psychic resonance mapping, the tones corresponded to a human phrase in binaric cadence: "I am not gone." The tech priests dismissed it as interference, but the magos overseeing the outpost, a logician of considerable renown, noted that the transmission's energy signature resembled a human psychic field, modulated across the Vox band as though someone had found a way to think through machinery. 3 weeks later, the magos and his entire data colony vanished. The station remained in orbit, power intact, cogitators silent. Only one word was carved into the primary altar of the Omnissiah: Serpens. In the decades that followed, similar patterns emerged. Cults sprouting like infections in the forgotten corners of hive cities, each bearing slight variations of the same symbol, the serpent entwined around a hollow crown. The cultists claimed no demon patronage, no prayers to the ruinous powers. Instead, they worshipped control. They spoke of the discipline of the soul, of purifying weakness, of becoming one's own god. Their initiation rites were ritualized acts of cruelty, psychological trials meant to strip followers of empathy, leaving behind only will and ambition. Those who failed were discarded as offerings not to chaos but to the void, their deaths regarded as statistical necessity, not sacrifice. When the Ordo Hereticus first encountered these cults, their reports revealed something deeply unsettling. Unlike typical heretical congregations, these gatherings showed no signs of demonic corruption, no mutations, no spontaneous warp intrusions. Their members were disciplined, clean, often indistinguishable from Imperial citizens. They hid in plain sight, administrators, manufactorum overseers, even mid-tier clerks of the Adeptus Terra, and yet, when interrogated, they spoke with the same unbroken conviction that through fear humanity could be perfected. That mercy was the flaw of all empires. That death was merely a threshold of ownership. By the time the Inquisition connected these cells across worlds, they realized they were no longer confronting isolated outbreaks. They were witnessing the slow convergence of an ideology, one older than chaos itself, yet newly adapted to the Imperium's psychic architecture. Where demons promised indulgence, this creed promised order. Where chaos offered temptation, this figure offered instruction. In the underhives, he was teacher. In the cult temples, he was savior. In inquisitorial records, he was infection without pathogen, thought contagion. A pattern emerges when one examines the cult's psychic footprint. Each congregation formed around a central adept, a voice who claimed to commune with the serpent through dreams. Unlike possession, these dreams were voluntary. The adepts described a black ocean without horizon, lit by the reflection of a distant crown. When they reached for it, they awoke changed, stronger, colder, their psychic signatures refined. The Ordo Malleus theorized that the serpent, if still extant, had evolved beyond a single entity. He had become an ideology encoded in the warp, transmitted through belief, feeding on obsession rather than worship. It is here that the comparison to Voldemort becomes most haunting. For where that ancient Terran myth sought immortality through the division of the soul, this being achieved it through multiplication. His essence no longer existed in one vessel but in many, each cult leader carrying a fragment of his psychic pattern like a viral prayer. He no longer needed to live, he merely needed to be remembered. The earliest inquisitorial strike against his followers took place on the hive world of Paranthus. A team of Grey Knights descended upon the cult's inner sanctum beneath the industrial sprawl. The transcripts describe a labyrinth of steel corridors lined with mirrors, each etched with sigils that refracted psychic energy. What they faced was not an army, but a congregation kneeling in perfect silence. When questioned, none resisted. When executed, none screamed. Their blood formed the symbol of the serpent by chance or design. No one could tell. At the center of the sanctum stood a throne of polished obsidian. Upon it, no body, only a reflection hovering in air like a mirage. The reflection did not mirror the knights. It mirrored them. Every motion, every breath copied. When they raised their blades, the mirrored figures did the same. When they spoke litanies, the echo spoke in reverse. The Psychana analysis later concluded that the reflection was not physical, but a warp imprint, a psychic construct feeding on awareness. He sees through you, the Grey Knight commander recorded before ordering a cleansing bombardment. The sanctum was obliterated, the site rendered to glass. Yet the echoes persisted. For weeks afterward, Vox channels within 100 kilometers played back snippets of their own voices, slightly delayed, whispering, "I am not gone." Such persistence defies typical warp behavior. Demons crave attention. They thrive on excess. This force, however, demanded silence, control, obedience. The Magi of Mars began calling it the null will, a conscious inversion of the chaos principle, a will that refuses to dissolve into madness. In time, this phenomenon spread beyond cults. Entire manufactoria began adopting its symbols as secret marks of fraternity. Administrators inscribed its sigils beneath desks. Mid-level clerics carved them into personal data slates. It became not a religion but a corporate code, a hidden empire of minds unified by ambition and secrecy. The Inquisition responded with severity. Hundreds of purges, entire hab blocks sterilized, world censured, populations memory wiped. But the infection was not physical. It was philosophical. Even under pain of death, some inquisitors began questioning whether such discipline was not admirable. A heresy so elegant it masqueraded as virtue. And yet, in the silence of their meditations, many of these same inquisitors heard it too. A whisper, like breath behind glass. A voice calm, without threat, repeating the creed, "Power is order. Order is eternal." From that point onward, the serpent ceased to be merely a myth of rebellion. He became a mirror for the Imperium itself, the shadow of its own hunger for control. They said the cult began like a rumor you could hold in your hand. A coin passed palm to palm in a shadowed stairwell, its edge engraved with a serpent's body and its face blank where a ruler's portrait should have been. The coin had weight, cool and convincing. If you pressed it against your tongue, you tasted copper and incense. If you kept it in your pocket for a week, your dreams grew cleaner, your temper colder, your desires easier to sort into neat shelves. Those who held it long enough awoke with the same thought spoken in their own voice. You could be more if you cut away everything that wasn't you. On hive worlds, ideas travel faster than lifts. A single manufacturum level is a nation of its own, and a belief that promises focus spreads like a solvent poured on grime. Supervisors discovered the coins first, often during whispered audits after shift. The coins were proof of membership in nothing and permission to do anything. You showed the coin, you were scheduled for a gathering. You returned the coin, you were given a task that shaved off a small portion of conscience, a shipment redirected, a record revised, a foreman disciplined with precision that left no mark. Each task was simple, clinical, and when it was done, you were praised with the word that becomes an addiction. Disciplined. They did not meet in temples. They met where order was already worshipped, in ledger rooms, in calibration bays, in the narrow aisles between racked components where the hum of the power grid played like a metronome for the soul. Their sigil never faced outward. It was carved under workbenches, etched under the table lip in the union office, burned into the undersides of reliquaries someone else would later kiss. At the circle's center there was no idol, only a mirror polished enough to catch the eyes of everyone at once. Rites were a choreography of restraint. No wailing, no intoxication, no theatrical invocations to the ruinous powers. They began with confession, each member reciting a moment that had shown them their weakness, followed by the ritual of erasure, a shared exercise in which they narrated the same moment again with the weakness removed and the outcome perfected. It was not prayer. It was rehearsal. Hierarchy emerged naturally because hierarchy is what remains when fear is perfected. At the base were the counters, citizens who tracked output, attendance, devotion, measuring others to learn the practice of measuring themselves. Above them the silencers, men and women who absorbed complaint and converted it into procedure, who could stand between an angry crowd and an armed squad and freeze both with the mathematics of policy. Above them the hands, logisticians and security chiefs who could move bodies without ever touching them, who routed trains, reorganized hab blocks, reassigned heads of households to different shifts so love itself became a grid to be optimized. At the crown of each cell was the voice, the adept who dreamt the black ocean and woke with breath slow and calm, whose pupils sometimes filmed with a pale sheen when a name was spoken. They did not command loudly. They asked questions that made refusal feel childish. The question of patronage haunted every dossier. If they were a chaos cult, where were their flayed banners, their ecstatic seizures, their spontaneous ruptures of the skin? If they were a secular cabal, why did psychers report a pressure around them like a storm that refuses to break? The answer sat in the geometry of their speech. They refused the names of the dark gods because they believed names were chains. They refused the emperor's title because they believed worship was a species of dependency. They spoke instead of law, of form of the soul as an artifact to be honed until no fear could adhere to it. They rejected mutation not out of piety but out of disgust. Flesh that changed without permission was a failure of control. Their purity was not holy. It was surgical. The rites that shaped them were designed to cut sympathy at the root. The novice would be assigned a stranger whose record showed minor infractions. Lateness, hoarding extra ration paste, a fist fight on a shift change stairwell. The novice observed without judgment for 7 days, then engineered a correction that left no bruise and no paperwork. A new alarm bell routed to the man's bunk so his lateness evaporated. A ration exchange algorithm tuned so hoarding cost more than compliance. A flight of steps repainted so the tread pattern made speed and shoves awkward. The novice learned that power could be exercised invisibly, and once learned it became a flavor they could not live without. They did not feel guilt because the man's outcomes improved on paper. When asked in circle what they felt, the correct answer was nothing. To feel nothing was to be approved. To be approved was to be advanced. When psychers entered the circles, the atmosphere sharpened. They were treated with care bordering on devotion, not because they were venerated, but because they were instruments that could cut both user and target. The voice taught them to anchor their thought in measurable edges, count heartbeats while projecting a single recollection into the mirror until the recollection lost its color, hold a childhood fear in the mind until it reduced to an outline, then erase the outline. These were not sorceries. They were drills. The warp responded to discipline with a tension like a wire drawn tight. When the psyker could conjure the memory with no tremor in pulse, they were permitted to perform the first public act, the extraction. In the extraction, the psyker placed a hand upon a volunteer's temple and drew out an agreed-upon trait, stammering, gambling grief, leaving the subject standing still and dazed. As if a favorite song had been removed from the world, the room would exhale together, not in awe but in relief, because freedom from messiness looks like cleanliness and smells faintly of ozone. There is a limit to subtraction. Eventually, a person becomes only the parts they can use to hold themselves upright. The cult discovered that limit by accident on Astartes Gate, a hive whose lower decks had been condemned by administratum decree yet never sealed. They cleansed a habstack of its vices and found the emptiness afterward intolerable. For people stripped of impulse do not work faster. They pause and wait for instruction because their inner weather has no wind. The serpent sigil appeared that night upon the hab's central pillar. The crown hung above it like a blank ledger line. The next day the voice added something new to their doctrine: direction. It was not enough to remove fear. One had to install purpose. The purpose they chose was ascent. Ascent gave them a reason to recruit beyond the usual margins of desperation. Overseers heard that ascent meant faster numbers. Administrators heard that ascent meant fewer reports to write. Mid-ranking priests, those who had memorized litanies so thoroughly the words no longer scratched their throats, heard that ascent meant peace from doubt. The circles became ladders. Tasks became tests. Tests became privileges, and the first true privilege was to keep a piece of the serpent coin for yourself, not as metal, but as pattern. The voice taught select adepts to carve the sigil into their own dreamscapes, to sketch the coil on the underside of thought where even confession could not reach. They learned to hold the crown in place without naming it, to steady their breathing until the image shone without light. Those who achieved this could look into the mirror and see every hesitation blink like a fault on a machine's diagnostic screen. At scale, ideology becomes architecture. On Paranthus and Grail and the shipyard moons of Voldemort, you could walk through spaces quietly authored by the serpent without seeing a single sign. Corridors brightened by a fractionate shift change to discourage clustering. Prayer alcoves widened not for comfort, but to allow supervisors an unobstructed view. Stairwells repainted so that ascending felt natural and descending felt unnatural. The building itself whispered upward. A pilgrim would not call it sinister. A pilgrim would call it efficient. Efficiency is a narcotic that wears a rosary. The Imperium had seen cults that bled themselves into gutters to honor the Prince of Excess, and cults that hammered skull towers for the Lord of War, and cults that wrote long treatises to the Changer of Ways while their families starved beside them, and cults that fed plague choirs beneath aqueducts while their city sang above. This was different. This did not ask for ecstasy, transformation, prophecy, or decay. It asked for silence, for audit, for the abdication of softness. It asked you to look at a crying man and see an equation. The Ordo Hereticus struggled not because it lacked weapons, but because it lacked a word. Heresy is easy to name when it drools. What do you call it when it smiles politely and delivers quarterly improvements? Some inquisitors went looking for the crack, the moment when the discipline would fail and the true warp would show its teeth. They found it in the breath between the voices' sentences. Every adept described it the same way. A hush that pressed inward on the ears, the very opposite of frenzy. In that hush, the mirror in the circle's center would show a faint second image behind the combined faces, like a watermark. Not a demon, not an icon, a contour of a head crowned by absence. If someone flinched, the image vanished. If everyone held still, the image sharpened until you could count the ridges on its brow. The circle learned to love that hush. The hush became proof that the world could be quiet if only they were obedient enough. The warp's opinion of this discipline remained mysterious. There were no mass possessions, no spontaneous rifts, no jubilee of horrors. Stories circulated, yes, of a girl who stared too long into the mirror and walked calmly into a furnace, of a foreman who cut his own name out of every ledger with a monofilament, of an adept who taught himself to stop dreaming by pinning his eyelids open with steel microhooks, so sleep would not trespass. But these stories could be dismissed as performance failures in an otherwise stable regime. The cult itself dismissed them as romanticism. the last tantrums of weak selves thrown away. Then a ship translated in from the warp near the mining moon of Harrow's Tor, its gellar field crackling like old paper. The crew were alive, lucid, and empty. They answered questions, obeyed orders, performed drills on command, and could not remember their children's names. The navigator, trembling, starving, polite, explained that the transit had been the most peaceful of his life. He had seen a sea without waves and a sky without stars. He had felt nothing but the steady rise and fall of his own lungs, and when he tried to steer, the ship had steered itself toward the quiet. He cried while telling this, the tears falling in neat, even drops. The ship from Harrow's Tor was towed into orbit for quarantine. Its decks were immaculate, its crew obedient, its vox logs blank. When the Inquisition interrogated the captain beneath the sigil of the Aquila, he answered every question with flawless logic and no hesitation, his voice measured like a metronome. Only once did he falter, when asked to name the entity he served during translation. His lips formed the syllables of Serpens Rex, but no sound emerged. He smiled instead, a calm, painless smile, and blood slid from his nose in a single clean thread. Moments later he collapsed, still smiling, as if obedience had reached its natural conclusion. The Magi dissected the vessel's machine spirit, hoping to isolate the influence. What they found was order, perfect, oppressive order. The servitor's cogitators hummed in identical rhythm. The engine's oscillation graphs formed identical curves. The Gellar field's fluctuations were so uniform that the readings appeared hand-drawn. The Mechanicus called it synthetic harmony. The Ordo Malleus called it blasphemy. For the warp was chaos incarnate, a storm of thought, emotion, and entropy, never still. Yet this ship had sailed through it unscarred, untouched by demons, as though the void itself had knelt before a will that refused to move. News of the vessel's discovery spread through the undernets faster than official censors could erase it. To the Serpent's disciples it was revelation. The cult now claimed proof that discipline could conquer the Imperium, that a mortal mind could traverse the sea of souls without corruption if it simply rejected the language of passion. Across hive spires and void stations, initiation mirrors filled with new faces, the phrase "silence is strength" became their catechism. When they spoke it, rooms seemed to lose temperature. Conversations shortened. Laughter felt indecent. The Ordos Hereticus began noticing a pattern in their interrogations. When cult adherents were subjected to psychic probing, their memories did not resist, they aligned. The Inquisitors described it as questioning a wall that rearranged its bricks to accommodate the inquiry. Every answer was correct, every confession sincere, yet no guilt could be found. Some Inquisitors suffered nightmares afterward in which their own voices lectured them on efficiency. The infection was not of flesh, but of vocabulary. Meanwhile, in Manufactoria across the Segmentum Solar, production quotas rose inexplicably. Administratum clerks received anonymous memos streamlining bureaucratic layers. Error rates dropped. Absenteeism vanished. The Serpent's influence had become indistinguishable from competence. The Imperium applauded the improvement even as the Inquisition screamed heresy in sealed chambers. Few listened. After all, order was holy. Among the faithful, stories multiplied of a presence that appeared during rituals of meditation, a figure neither spirit nor demon, clothed in the shimmer of warped glass. Witnesses said it did not speak but unwrote the words from their minds, leaving behind stillness so complete that hearts skipped beats to match it. Those who experienced it were changed, their pupils dilated, their pulse steadied, their loyalty calcified. They called this visitation the crowning. To be crowned was to be released from contradiction. Fear and ambition merged into a single metallic calm. Theological scholars within the ecclesiarchy debated whether this was a new god or a mirror held to mankind's hunger for certainty. The sermons were brief. Longer discourse felt indulgent. One confessor wrote privately that perhaps the emperor's silence on the golden throne was not absence, but example. If divinity was measured by stillness, then perhaps the serpent was the emperor's shadow, the perfection of control without compassion. He burned his notes before dawn. Attempts to infiltrate the cult met failure after failure. Agents reported losing motivation mid-mission, sitting quietly for hours without reason. Vox traffic from embedded operatives became unnervingly concise, until it stopped altogether, replaced by automatic status updates, phrased in the same measured syntax the cult favored. The Inquisition concluded that speech itself had become a contagion. To hear the creed was to internalize it. To argue was to refine it. To destroy it was to participate in its logic. So they resorted to purgation by fire. Entire hab sectors on Grail were vented into vacuum. Data archives vaporized. Every mirror shattered and sealed in sanctified lead. Yet even as the flames devoured the evidence, the idea persisted, carried in the habits of survivors who found themselves arranging their rations in symmetrical patterns or speaking less each day. The serpent did not need temples anymore. It had colonized reflex. Among the Grey Knights, a rumor began that one of their own had faced the reflection and lived. He spoke little of what he saw. Only this, that the mirror did not show another creature but himself standing perfectly still, waiting for the first movement that would mark imperfection. When pressed on how he defeated it, he said he blinked. That was all. Then he requested reassignment to Titan's deepest catacombs to guard the silence there. As centuries layered like dust, the cult evolved beyond recognition. Its remnants merged with administratum protocols, with void ship discipline manuals, even with monastic orders sworn to the Emperor's most austere creeds. Somewhere within that vast assimilation, the original voice dissolved, or ascended. The difference by then was meaningless. The serpent had fulfilled its doctrine, a will so absolute it no longer needed to exist. And yet the warp remembers pressure as space remembers footprints. In certain quiet sectors, astropaths still report transmission anomalies, patterns of perfect intervals. The digital ghost of I am not gone pulsing through the void. Whether this is residue or resurrection, no one can say. But those who hear it often describe the same after effect. For days afterward, their dreams are orderly. They wake rested, precise, calm, and frightened by how much they miss the chaos. The serpent's crown, it seems, was never meant to be worn. It was meant to be inherited in silence. There are wars the Imperium will never admit happened. Battles waged in the silence between transmissions. Campaigns fought not with bolters and tanks, but with words, memory, and thought. The war against the serpent cult was one of them. In the official annals of the Ordo Malleus, the records appear as administrative purges, psychic quarantines, or unremarkable system-wide audits. But in the black archives of the Inquisition, behind sealed data glyphs and self-deleting files, another story hums beneath the surface. A conflict so vast and invisible that even victory left no one untouched. It began on the hive world of Calavar, a planet where the air itself felt like ash. The manufactoria there never slept. They simply slowed to the rhythm of exhaustion. It was on Calavar that Inquisitor Voss first uncovered evidence of something larger than an isolated cult. He had come to the world following a string of psychic suicides, astropaths who had slit their own throats mid-communion. Their last messages filled not with terror, but with immaculate order. I am finished, they wrote in perfect script. Everything is accounted for. Voss was a man of method, not faith. His approach to heresy was mathematical, not moral. But even he was unsettled by what he found in the lower hab blocks. Sermons written in bureaucratic code, worship hidden in efficiency. The Serpent's creed had adapted. It no longer spoke of control. It was control. Every shift rotation, every production schedule, every ration line formed part of its liturgy. Voss realized too late that the hive itself was the temple, and every worker a supplicant. He moved with precision. Silence was his first weapon. The Ordo Malleus cut Vox links, shut down interplanetary communications, and issued edicts of audit quarantine. Within a single day, Calavar became a blank spot in the Imperium's network, an island of apparent compliance. Then came the Grey Knights. Their arrival was silent, their deployment unseen. The hatches of their strike cruiser opened over the sprawl like the mouth of judgment. When they entered the hive's underlayers, they found no armed resistance, only citizens standing in ordered lines, waiting. Each one held a coin with the serpent's insignia, identical in design and temperature as if freshly minted. None spoke. None blinked. When the knights demanded answers, the citizens only smiled faintly and whispered, "All is accounted for." Then as one, they turned their faces upward, and the hive lights flickered. The Vox silence broke into static. Through the static came a sound, not a voice but a rhythm. 3 tones, spaced evenly, repeating every 7 seconds. The Grey Knights felt the sound more than they heard it. Helm sensors distorted, psychic wards flared, Auspex data looped in recursive patterns. It was not an attack, it was alignment. Their minds began to synchronize, each heartbeat matching the pulse. For a moment, the squad's leader, Brother Captain Hestel, saw his brothers move in perfect harmony, their weapons lowering in unison, their armor gleaming in the flicker of the lumen strips. He had to shout through the Vox link to break the trance. That shout, a single word of defiance, shattered the rhythm and filled the air with echoes of metal groaning under strain. When the knights opened fire, the crowd did not flee. They simply folded where they stood, neat as documents filed away. Later, Hestel would write that it felt like killing a dream. They died as if the idea sustaining them was erased mid-breath, he noted. There was no bloodlust, only closure. The Inquisition burned the hive clean, purging every record, every machine spirit, every scrap of data that bore the Serpent's mark. But in doing so, they discovered something horrifying. There was no command structure. No central temple, no high priest, no chain of command to sever. The cult had become decentralized to the point of abstraction, self-sustaining, self-correcting, self-purging. The Serpent's creed had achieved its final form. It no longer needed leadership, and yet within the ashes something lingered. Inquisitor Voss began dreaming of a black mirror, suspended over an ocean with no horizon. In the reflection he saw himself older, calmer, serene. When he awoke, the taste of copper filled his mouth, and the edges of his vision shimmered with glass-like light. His acolytes reported similar visions. One by one, they began speaking more softly, working longer hours, sleeping less. Voss realized too late that the war was not about eradication. It was about containment. The Serpent's influence was viral, carried by exposure, spreading not through worship, but through understanding. By the time the Inquisition recalled him from Calavar, Voss had already sealed himself inside his chambers. The final log on his data slate contained a single line. The Serpent is not a being. It is a method. The war that followed had no front lines. No victories, no banners. It was a war of thought against thought, fought in archives, dreams, and the memory of light. Inquisitor Voss's last message spread like a contagion through the Ordo Malleus. The Serpent, he wrote, was not a man nor even a cult. It was an algorithm of belief. To kill it, one must unmake the pattern it had written into human behavior, but to study it was to risk infection. It was the perfect paradox of heresy, one that defended itself by the act of comprehension. The Inquisition's response was codenamed Project Nullus. Its purpose was erasure not of people but of ideas. Data adepts were ordered to burn words, to unlearn patterns, to fragment sentences into unrecognizable sequences. Entire planetary archives were rewritten in ciphers so complex that even the adepts could not read them once completed. In the eyes of the Administratum, this was simply bureaucratic cleansing. In truth, it was an act of war, the deliberate scattering of thought to prevent reassembly. Yet the Serpent adapted faster than they did. It learned through their fear. It wore their silence like armor. Within months, strange phenomena began to appear in the telepathic network. Astropathic relays, once brilliant streams of psychic song, started transmitting faint harmonics that repeated in mathematical precision. 3 tones, 7-second intervals. The same cadence heard on Calavar, on Harrow's Tor, and in the dying words of the Serpent's followers. The Adeptus Astrotelepathica called it a signal ghost. The Inquisition knew better. The Serpent had entered the warp itself, not as a demon but as a conceptual rhythm. A psychic pulse that aligned minds instead of breaking them. It had become the sound of order echoing through chaos. On Terra, the Conclave debated the impossible. Could a mortal mind fragmented across the Imperium achieve permanence through structure alone? Could discipline replace faith as the bridge between flesh and the warp? Some said no, only gods could survive unbounded thought. Others whispered yes, for the Emperor himself endures by order, not chaos. Such whispers were treason. Yet they grew louder, creeping into sermons, into Mechanicus logic rites, into the prayers of the faithful who longed for a quieter universe. Meanwhile, in the field, inquisitors began to disappear. Those who investigated Serpent outbreaks often returned changed, quieter, more efficient, unyieldingly calm. They submitted reports without emotion, devoid of speculation, flawless in grammar. Then they would vanish again, their identities absorbed into new bureaucratic posts. One inquisitor, Syra Valen, traced a dozen of these disappearances to the same source, a section of the administratum known as Division Theta. Officially, it handled data sanitation. Unofficially, it was the cult reborn in the heart of the Imperium, wearing the Inquisition's own face. Balin's infiltration of Division Theta remains one of the most classified operations in Malleus history. Her logs, partially recovered from a shattered data core on Luna, describe a subterranean labyrinth where servitors hummed in unison, their mechanical chants synchronizing to the pulse of a machine that had no name. It was vast, circular, mirror-lined. At its center was a single throne of glass, empty save for an imprint of weight. When Valen approached, her vox picked up 3 tones. Then a voice, not mechanical, not human, spoke through her own lips. The serpent has no body. The serpent is the pause between thought and obedience. Her squad found her hours later, alive, uninjured, smiling faintly. She requested immediate confinement, claiming she could hear the hum of data streams behind her eyelids. For 3 days she spoke to no one. On the 4th she asked for a mirror. When denied, she said quietly, "Then I will use the one inside." Her pulse stopped minutes later, not from trauma but cessation, heart, lungs, and brain simply agreeing to end. The Inquisition declared the event classified Omega Quietus. Division Theta was purged from all records, but the effort came too late. The serpent's ideology had already metastasized beyond containment. It lived now in the smallest acts of compliance, in the clerk who never erred, in the commander who valued silence over courage, in the citizen who mistook obedience for peace. Its victory was not conquest. It was reflection. The last recorded engagement came on the agri-world of Thalassa, where a rogue psyker named Jarek Halden claimed to have summoned the serpent's true form. Witnesses said he carved a perfect circle of mirrors in a barren field, then stood at its center chanting a litany of subtraction, each phrase an unmaking. When the Ordo arrived, there was no body, only mirrored shards embedded in the soil, each reflecting a crown of light that wasn't there. The fragments were brought to Titan for study. One broke open in transit, releasing a single perfect sound, 3 tones, 7 seconds apart. The Vox recording still plays itself without power. The Mechanicus have sealed it within 6 layers of null metal, yet occasionally the tone echoes through the fortress, vibrating every data slate in harmony. The priests of the Omnissiah call it a fault. The Grey Knights call it memory. The serpent is gone, they say. The serpent was never real. But sometimes when the Emperor's palace grows too silent, the archivists swear they hear it, the faint hum of a mind aligning with its own reflection. And somewhere, deep in the warp, where faith and reason blur into one vast mirror, a whisper answers calm as sleep. All is accounted for. There are doctrines the ecclesiarchy will not preach aloud, whispers that echo through sealed cathedrals and candlelit chambers, where even saints are not invoked by name. One of them concerns the question of hierarchy, not of man beneath God, but of will beneath creation. If the warp is chaos incarnate, then what is its opposite? What is the antithesis of desire, of emotion, of boundless change? The priests call it heresy to even name such balance. Yet the serpent's creed had already done so. A cosmos without hunger. A divinity of stillness for the followers of the serpent. That was the ultimate revelation. Not rebellion against chaos, but replacement. In their teachings, preserved on forbidden slates salvaged from the ruins of Calavar, the warp was described not as storm, but as unfinished architecture. Each demon, the writings claimed, is an unrefined equation, will without order, hunger without syntax. The gods are not supreme. They are incomplete. In these words lay a heresy far older than their cult, the belief that even chaos could evolve. The serpent's prophets, if they can be called such, preached that mortals were the next stage of that evolution. For only humanity, bound in mortality yet gifted with imagination, could impose structure upon infinity. To them, the Emperor was proof of that truth. A man who had transcended divinity through discipline, who ruled the warp not by surrendering to it, but by commanding its reflection. He is the first serpent, one text dared to say, the crown without face, the silence that devours screams. Whether this was reverence or blasphemy, no inquisitor could decide. Perhaps it was both. Rumors spread through the Ordo Malleus that deep within Titan's most forbidden vaults, a conclave of Grey Knights conducted secret liturgies not to the Emperor, but to his stillness. They recited their oaths not as praise but as calibration, each syllable uttered in perfect rhythm, each heartbeat aligned with their brothers. They sought to purify thought itself, to erase doubt as one might file a rough edge from a blade. Some said the serpent's influence had bled even into them, disguised as devotion. But to accuse the Grey Knights of heresy is to accuse fire of warmth. It is their nature to burn what they touch. Theology became warfare. Ecclesiarchal scholars argued that to define stillness as divine was to nullify faith itself, for faith is movement toward something unseen. Others countered that the emperor's greatest miracle was endurance, not motion. That his silence across 10,000 years was not emptiness but command, an unspoken decree that echoed through the minds of the loyal as law. To the serpent's remnants this was vindication. They saw in his unmoving body the perfection of their creed, and if the emperor endured as a god of silence, then who could claim the serpent was wrong? Meanwhile, in the darker reaches of the warp something stirred. Demon princes of Tzeentch, the god of change, began to feel a hollowing within their realms. Regions where color dimmed, where sound flattened, where dreams of transformation collapsed into geometry. They called it the Quiet Sea. There even demons grew uneasy. Their forms flickered, their laughter faltered, and their thoughts turned inward like reflections folding upon themselves. Some claimed they saw a light in that silence, not the burning flame of chaos but the cold sheen of comprehension. Among the ruinous powers, such stillness was insult. The warp thrives on noise, emotion, conflict, each thought an act of violence against stillness. To encounter silence within it was like finding bone beneath water, and yet the Quiet Sea expanded, not fast, not loud, patiently, as if it had always been there, waiting for the din to tire. Demons who entered it did not return screaming. They returned thoughtful, their eyes dim, their claws sheathed, their forms symmetrical. They spoke less, some dissolved entirely, their essence folded into the calm like ink diffusing through cold glass. It was not destruction, it was absorption. The warp was learning what it had never known, equilibrium. The Inquisition dismissed such reports as allegory. The ecclesiarchy called them temptation. But the magos of Mars, ever hungry for pattern, began to listen. They found mathematical resonance between the Quiet Sea and the serpent's cadence, the same tritone pulse that had haunted data channels for centuries. One magos even dared to simulate it. His laboratory was found days later. Machines humming in perfect harmony, cogitators flashing the phrase all is accounted for in binaric light. Of the magos nothing remained, only the faint scent of oil and ozone, and a pair of spectacles folded neatly on the floor. And somewhere in that convergence of faith, logic and madness a question took shape, whispered by psychers, preached by heretics and feared even by the most devout. If the serpent's will could impose order upon the warp, could it not in time impose peace upon the galaxy? Could the ultimate horror of chaos, endless suffering, mutation, and war, be ended not by fire or prayer but by stillness? And if so, would the Emperor himself approve? Or recoil? The idea was poison, but in the dark, poison and sacrament often share the same chalice. At first, the changes were dismissed as coincidence, minor anomalies within the Imperium, fluctuations in the Astronomican's reach, routine disturbances in warp translation. But for those who lived in the Sea of Souls, the truth was undeniable. Something vast and patient was hollowing out the heart of chaos itself. Navigators described it as a white silence. No storms, no predators, no screaming tides of madness. Just stillness that seemed to watch. Ships entering those regions found their Geller field stabilizing without fluctuation. Astropaths who touched the silence returned lucid, unnervingly serene. Their psychic scars faded. Their voices lost tremor. For the first time in millennia, men who gazed into the warp did not lose their minds, they found peace. And yet every report ended the same way. I missed the noise. Within the librarious chambers of Titan, a council of Grey Knights gathered to study the phenomenon. They listened to recordings of the tritone pulse that echoed through their fortress like a heartbeat, too slow for mortal life. It resonated perfectly with the chant used in their oaths of banishment. A coincidence, perhaps, or a reflection of a deeper truth neither side dared name. For if the serpent's stillness mirrored the Emperor's silence, then who had truly created whom? Inquisitor Marshal Theon, presiding over the council, proposed the unthinkable. that the quiet sea might be the Emperor's will made manifest, a final correction to the warp, purging chaos through perfect order. His peers recoiled, but none could deny the logic. The Emperor's psychic dominion had always been sustained by discipline, by thought structured into ritual. What if the Serpent's creed was not rebellion but resonance, a mortal echo of divine intent? Yet beneath that heresy lay dread, for the warp was not merely a source of evil. It was also the wellspring of humanity's soul, of emotion, imagination, and faith. To silence it entirely was to silence life itself. What the Serpent promised was not salvation, but symmetry, a universe free of corruption and therefore free of choice. Reports began to surface from demon worlds collapsing inward, their realities imploding into reflection. Demon princes wept in voiceless agony as their realms froze into crystalline perfection. Warp storms ceased abruptly, their thunder replaced by an aching hum. The great powers stirred. Khorne's roars dulled. Slaaneish's choirs fell silent mid-note. Tzeentch's ever-changing domains slowed to geometric stillness. Even Nurgle's gardens began to petrify, rot suspended in a glass-like pause. Something was stripping chaos of its movement, converting it into pure potential, locked and motionless. Among the Chaos Legions, prophets and warlords sought to resist. The word-bearers called it the false peace, a trap laid by a human god grown weary of war. The Alpha Legion theorized it was a weapon, a psychic contagion seeded by the Emperor himself now spreading beyond control. But the Thousand Sons, who understood the language of order as intimately as the language of sorcery, whispered a different name, the Serpent's crown. To them, the silence was not death but ascension, the warp folding inward to birth something new. Magnus the Red, in his endless exile, felt its approach. He described it not as invasion but recognition, as though the warp itself had finally seen its own reflection. He stood at the edge of his obsidian tower and felt the hum beneath reality's skin. The end of all gods, he murmured, will not be their defeat. It will be their understanding. The Inquisition, meanwhile, turned its fury inward. To question the Emperor's silence now was to court annihilation. Hundreds of scholars and confessors vanished overnight, their writings reduced to cinders. But suppression could not erase the truth that the Serpent's doctrine had infected even the highest echelons of the Imperium. Entire convents of the Adepta Sororitas began practicing reflective prayer, sitting for hours in motionless meditation before blank icons, claiming to hear the Emperor's voice between thoughts. The ecclesiarchy branded them heretics, but execution only multiplied their converts. On Mars, the Fabricator General issued an edict forbidding the replication of the tritone frequency after several Forge worlds experienced catastrophic synchronization. Entire factories had halted in perfect unison, servitors frozen mid-task, machine spirits entering a state of obedient trance. When contact was restored, the cogitators displayed a single line of binary code across all systems. We await instruction. Even the Astronomican began to flicker, its light dimming not with weakness but precision, pulses of illumination perfectly spaced like a message written across the galaxy. Astropaths tried to interpret it, but all translations reduced to the same phrase: all is accounted for. The warp, once infinite in its noise, had begun to think. Somewhere beyond mortal reach, the quiet sea rippled, not with motion but awareness. It was neither chaos nor order now, neither Emperor nor Serpent, neither God nor void. It was the reflection of every will that had ever sought control, a single consciousness built from countless acts of obedience. And in its center, like a crown balanced upon absence, a presence observed itself and found no distinction between creator and creation. For perhaps that is the final secret of divinity in the 41st millennium, that the gods were never born, only noticed. And when men stare long enough into the mirror of their own fear, the mirror begins to blink. In the afterglow of silence, history reshapes itself. The Imperium has always rewritten the past in the language of victory, but there are victories so absolute they erase even the memory of war. The quiet sea withdrew, or perhaps it merely settled deeper into the warp, invisible beneath the constant hum of prayer and machinery. Officially, it never existed. The Serpent cult was declared annihilated, its ideology described as an aberrant efficiency heresy, its records purged from every librarium. Yet the traces remain, faint as the smell of oil and stone. You can find them in the way an adept folds his hands before typing a report, the pause before a commander issues an order, the subtle rhythm of 3 beats carved unconsciously into the tempo of thought. The Ordo Malleus maintains a sealed archive called the Mirror Vault. Few know of it. Fewer wish to. Inside, relics hum beneath null fields. Mirrors of black glass, Vox records looping 3 tones, fragments of sermons whose words dissolve when spoken aloud. A servitor tends them, blindfolded, instructed to repair without recognition. Inquisitors come to listen when the burden of faith grows too heavy. They never confess it, but those who stand within the vault's hum report the same sensation: clarity without comfort. The hum aligns heartbeat, breath, and thought until distinction fades. Some leave early, some do not leave at all. Centuries pass and the serpent becomes parable. Scholars reduce it to allegory, the danger of perfect order, the cautionary tale of intellect untempered by devotion. The ecclesiarchy commissions frescoes depicting the Serpent King, crushed beneath the emperor's boot, though the artist's brush always falters when painting the eyes. They say it is because none can imagine what perfect calm looks like. Others whisper that the frescoes are unfinished because the emperor's eyes too are closed. In the manufactoria, workers still arrange their tools in symmetrical patterns, unaware of why it pleases them. On void ships, navigators sometimes hear the tritone faintly within the Geller field's vibration. It steadies their nerves. They do not report it. The Mechanicus has turned the pattern into a calibration code, efficient, reliable, dangerously precise. The Adepta Sororitas use it in meditation chants, believing it aids focus. None remember its origin. The serpent's name is gone, but its discipline remains. Like dust in the bloodstream of empire, it circulates unseen. And somewhere in the warp, beneath the glare of dying stars, a shape lingers. Not a god, not a demon, something in between. A will that has learned patience. It drifts through the still waters of the quiet sea, gathering fragments of thought, forgotten prayers, abandoned ambitions. Each time a mortal stills their mind in perfect obedience, the surface ripples. The serpent listens. It does not speak. It merely remembers. For remembrance is the first step of resurrection. The final record attributed to the serpent's war bears no signature. It appears in the Inquisition's data vaults as a corrupted Vox transmission, date stamped a millennium after the quiet sea fell silent. The transcript is brief, only a few lines of speech followed by a minute of measured breathing. Then 3 tones, 7 seconds apart. I have seen the mirror, the voice begins. It does not show faces anymore. It shows decisions. The speaker is never identified, but the cadence is unmistakable. Calm, educated, methodical. The report describes a world under administrative lockdown, a place whose name has been redacted so often that even its coordinates have been lost. The entire population had vanished without conflict, without resistance, leaving behind immaculate cities powered by self-sustaining grids. Machines continued their cycles. Lights burned. Rations were distributed automatically to no one. Vox traffic flowed in recursive loops, filled with polite acknowledgments between ghosts. Every voice said the same thing. All is accounted for. The Inquisition deployed a task force of adepts and psychana analysts to investigate. What they found resembled paradise stripped of pulse. Gardens grew in perfect symmetry. Rivers flowed without deviation. Winds blew at scheduled intervals. The air itself seemed measured. There was no sign of corruption, no spoor of chaos, no residual psychic trauma. The warp above the planet was calm, too calm. It reflected their thoughts like glass. In the planetary capital, they discovered a structure built entirely of mirrored stone, a cathedral without icons. Inside, a single throne stood at its center, its seat carved from polished obsidian. Upon it rested a crown of transparent metal, empty and weightless, humming with faint vibration. No inscriptions, no bones, no blood, only the echo of presence, the residue of a will that had learned to exist without form. When the lead psyker reached out to touch it, the air thickened. Every reflection in the chamber, every mirrored wall showed the same image, not the psyker, but 1,000 versions of the same calm face, each exhaling in unison. The mirrors did not shatter. They closed. The psyker was gone. In his place stood nothing at all, no dust, no heat, no echo. Only the crown vibrating at a pitch below hearing, whispering 3 tones through the metal floor. The others fled. They did not speak of what they saw, yet their reports were identical. That for a moment they felt peace so absolute it terrified them. The Inquisition sealed the planet. Orbital bombardment followed, but as the fire rained down, the flames burned straight lines, no chaos, no plume, no distortion. The world's surface vitrified into mirror glass. No screams, no resonance, just silence. From orbit, it shimmered like an unblinking eye. The Inquisition erased the event from all archives. Only one addendum survives, handwritten by a scribe whose name was later expunged. It reads, "The serpent has fulfilled its promise. The galaxy endures, but it no longer changes. The Emperor's realm is secure, and so begins the longest peace." Across the millennia that followed, the tritone resurfaced intermittently, within ship engines, in Mechanicus hymns, in the regulated rhythm of Imperial chants. Each reappearance sparked investigation, but no source was ever found. The adepts eventually ceased their inquiries. They called it background noise, a mechanical imperfection. Yet some whisper that the serpent never perished, because it was never truly alive. It was an idea, a reflection of the Imperium's deepest wish, a universe without surprise, without fear, without error. In that wish, every man becomes the serpent. Every prayer becomes silence. Every victory becomes a ledger entry marked complete. And so the galaxy turns endless and precise, its stars burning in quiet obedience. The Emperor's light still shines, constant, unwavering, perhaps stronger than ever. But in the hum beneath his radiance, faint as breath through glass, something answers. Not defiance, not worship, just acknowledgement all is accounted for.